Welcome back. Lake Speed Jr. here, along with Jimmy Barton and David Lewis from Roush-Yates Racing. If you were hanging around all day, you saw us talking this morning about blocks. Well, now, thanks to the guys at Diamond, they've set us up. We're going to talk a little bit about pistons, wrist pins, coatings, clearances, all those little things about, you guys know I love the ring seal soup. So making that piston happy. So let's talk about that a little bit. And first thing, let's really talk about piston materials. And you guys are the pro engine builders. So give me a little bit of an idea. Everybody knows that 2618, 4032, hyper-eutectic. There's lots of different piston materials, but typically most race pistons are going to be 2618. So why is that?
Well, because it's a more durable material. It's probably the strongest of the materials. It's noisy in a street car. That's why they use the 4032.
That's based on thermal expansion.
Based on thermal expansion. These don't expand as quick. They do get quiet, but they run looser clearance than the 4032s also.
Right.
Because they grow more than the 4032s.
Right. That's why you have to have more clearance to begin with cold, which is why you get the more noise, because you're getting more slapping around.
And yes, the 4032 is more I won't say it's a street piston because it's really an upgrade from a cast or a hyper-eutectic piston, but in the classic car world or whatever, you'd want a 4032 if you're worried about the noise the motor's going to make while it's cold, or if you've got a quiet exhaust system on it where you can hear the pistons. So, I mean, the 2618s with above 6,000 clearance on them, they rattle when they're cold.
Right.
I mean, they're going to.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
And your knock sensors in your late model cars, if you put them in there, pick them up. So
interesting.
So the 4032,
makes sense.
Well, it's the same thing he was talking about on the balance earlier.
Exactly.
The sensors in the car, they balance stuff better because of the noise. Well, you got to have the tighter clearance piston to do away with the noise in your computer cars.
Exactly.
So.
I know from doing some testing with Ben Strader, who was on one of the videos earlier, on direct injection engines like an LT1, LT4, LT5, being a DI engine, those engines do have some low speed pre-ignition, some detonation stuff, and that knock sensor, you don't want to give it a false positive because of what Randy said. It's going to do all these other things to try to protect itself, which really isn't what you want the engine doing anyway.
No, I mean, it can fatten the fuel system up, it can knock timing out of it, and if you're at a red light and you need to go, you want timing.
Right, exactly, yeah. Especially if it's who's parked next to you, right? Well, we didn't say that. No, that's all good. So beyond the piston material, we're looking at this one. This is what we would consider a reverse dish style. So obviously through the NASCAR days, I can remember back in the old days where you had the old domed pistons to try to get the compression, and you work that way. Well, things have kind of changed. So, I mean, you've been around all this from many eras of evolution. So give me your perspective on that dome versus the reverse dish versus a flat top.
Well, back in the 70s when you had the cast iron heads and you were using production heads, the chambers were big in them.
Right.
So in order to make compression, you put a dome on the piston. Well, now, in these years, everybody's making cylinder heads. They can make the chamber smaller.
Right.
But when you make the chamber flatter and the valve angle flatter, you don't need the dome piston anymore. Plus the dome piston, if you remember, the small block Chevrolets run real good with 40, 42 degrees of timing in them. Nowadays, you rarely see over 30.
Right.
I mean, it's all chamber design and piston design.
And the big reason for that excessive, we call it excessive now, but that higher level of timing is because that flame path had to go so much further because you got this mountain in the way.
It's strictly flame provocation. I mean, if you remember back in the big block days, people would grind a slot in them where the spark plug had a flame notch.
Right.
And it was to get the flame to travel better. Well, the purpose of the smaller chamber in the dish is to get the spark plug to the center of the mass. This makes up the bottom of the chamber. That's why it's called a reverse dome.
Right.
You have the same, approximately the same thing in the piston as you have in the chamber.
Exactly.
And you want to put the spark plug close to the center of that chamber. That's why the Hemi works so well, because the spark plug's in between the valves in the center of the chamber. And the Hemi also had a dome piston, but
Exactly.
And the Hemi lends itself to a power adder too.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of good things there. I mean, my dad, still does the vintage go-kart stuff, same area from your dad, David, and those are all two-strokes are all domed pistons as well, and dome cylinder heads. So I mean, there's obviously something about that having that flame path, because the whole goal to make power is to burn all the fuel so you can combust the air and make heat, because that's what expands the air and causes the piston to make work.
I mean, I would rather have flame travel than compression. I mean, perfect example, years ago, 706 drag motor, big compression, wouldn't run. I took the motor from a man when I was in Birmingham and cut the dome off his piston. Well, he had a fit because I cut his compression down from really high down to like 11.5, 12 to 1. Well, the motor run better without the compression. It didn't take as much time, but he had a fit. He thought he had to have compression to make all that horsepower, which, once they got the chambers on the heads better and you could put a dish in the piston or a flat top or even a shorter, rounder dome that didn't have a lot of peaks in it, it makes all the difference in the world of the dome shape of the piston.
Yeah, again, is it flame travel? We want to burn the fuel. If the flame can't travel, it can't burn that gas mixture over here, which is going to generate work.
Just like the Diamond video before us said. They were making clay molds or sending parts in to make the piston off of. They were scanning the chamber so the piston would fit the chamber, because they didn't want all them sharp edges and all.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it's all related to flame travel.
So, moving on from piston design for those reasons, one of the other things here, and of course the Diamond guys have their logo nicely in there, is skirt coatings. Obviously, the skirt of the piston is riding on a film of oil. It's not going to be contacting the bore, we hope, under any circumstance. So that skirt design is also really important. So why don't you elaborate a little bit about, you guys have lots of different experience on different motors and different piston designs.
Well, the cams on the skirts are different based on what clearances you want. And also, just like talking with the honing procedure, how much oil is held in the hone. Primarily, in my opinion, and strictly my opinion, the skirt coatings are for cold crank-up.
Yes.
And what does David think about it?
I would agree. We've seen the same thing, and it all has to do with the cam of the piston and the stiffness of the cylinder wall versus the cam on the piston itself.
Right. My analogy, I would say, about the cam of the piston and that skirt profile is no different than a water ski. Because it's that hydrodynamic lubrication is what we call what the piston's being lubricated by. I'm being the oil geek here for a minute. So really, if you think about lubrication, there's 3 different stages of lubrication. You've got boundary film, which is that metal on metal. That's your flat tappet cam, which is why the whole ZDP thing for 15, 20 years has been a topic of conversation, which I think there's going to be a video tomorrow to talk about that a little bit. But that metal on metal contact, that's boundary lubrication, and that's where the additives in the oil do all the work. The next thing is going to be that, they call it mixed film. That's that piston rings or near ring reversal are going to be somewhat boundary, but also somewhat on the oil film. That full film oil film, that is what we call hydrodynamic. And the best analogy is, if you think about water skiing, if the boat's not moving, where are you? You're down in the water. But as the boat begins to move and gain speed, the skier comes up out of the water. But anybody that's been around water skiing and boats a lot knows that, a slalom ski, the boat's got to go a lot faster to get the slalom skier up. But a wakeboard pops right up. So that's back to that piston skirt design you're talking about. That lubrication property, with everything else being the same, that skirt design is that narrow ski or that wakeboard design, if you will, to try to cause that lubrication property to begin to happen.
And there, the cam is to deal with the thermal properties of the cylinder growing and the piston growing.
So it's going to open out.
How much rock it's got in it. And that's all related to different engines and different cooling packages and all that. And also, it's just, the piston's just like a bearing. You want the ring to touch the cylinder wall and the skirts not to.
Exactly.
You want the skirts to ride on oil, the rings to touch the cylinder wall.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to seal up. One last thing before we close this segment and move to the Q&A segment of this. wrist pins. So obviously, to me, again, just my opinion, this is the backbone of the piston. I know some guys have different theories on how wide it should be, what wall thickness it should be, taper. You've been to Bonneville and gone, 277 miles an hour backwards, but that's a story for another day. As a Bonneville guy and building lots of different engines, let me know a little bit about what your thoughts are on that.
The deal on the wrist pins, the standard wrist pin used to be 2/900, 927. Okay, everybody's down to 2 inch 750, and the deal is you take a pencil and grab it out at the ends, you can bend it and break it.
Right.
If you give it a little thicker wall like this pin and shorten it up to 2 inches, or break that pencil in half and try to break it again, it just don't flex as much.
Right.
And now they've moved the pin bores inbound on the piston so that it's got the same area in the wrist pin area.
Yeah, the pin boss is the same
The
area.
pin bosses is the same area as it was on the 2950 pin. So you don't have the moment of deflection in it in the shorter pin that you did in the longer pin.
Fantastic. So I think we've now reached the Q&A section of this, so I will try my best to operate this device. Perfect. Here we go. Now let's see if we've got any questions here. Okay. Are they able to take some clearance? Okay. Can you take away some of that extra running clearance that you need for a 2618 by using a coating? I know I've never personally used it, but the line-to-line coating is an abradable skirt coating. Have you guys ever come across or used any of the line-to-line coating?
I've never used it myself.
Okay.
I know some people that have used it in superchargers
Right.
that let the rotors make their own clearance and fit. I think it would work on this application. Where it would stop, we haven't done it, we don't know.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's a good idea, good thought process.
Definitely a good
You
idea.
know, yeah, but make sure you see. That's a good. Who that was Kenny. Thanks, Kenny. Good thought. Good question.
Definitely.
Oh, here we go. Dima Elgin. You guys know who Dima Elgin is, right?
I know of it.
Yeah. Okay. So Dima is watching. Hey, Dima. Good to see you. Thanks for the question. He said, remember that with higher compression, you have more pumping loss as well. Plus, with the dome, you have more surface area, which can also not be so good. So,
I mean, and a dome piston is not necessarily a balanced piston unless it's a hollow dome piston. If it's a solid dome piston, you're going to have one side of it's heavier than the other.
now you're going to get more piston rock,
And
the more the one piston wants to rock,
and
now
that-
you're unseating the rings, and you're defeating the whole purpose of everything.
That was the whole purpose for making the hollow dome piston, trying to balance it.
Got it.
So,
Okay.
I think the water skier is going to fall over.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the ski's got too narrow on us out.
Yep.
So here's a good question from Joe. Any difference between a press pin or a floating pin?
there's schools of thought on that. The press pin is basically for production automobile stuff. You heat the rod and put it on. Nowadays, used to you pressed them together and they skin them going through the pin bore. You got 2 rotating parts in the piston versus 3 when you got a floating pin.
Right.
I mean, you make the piston, usually we put a smaller amount of clearance in it than the rod, because the rod being steel tends to tighten up on the pin, and the piston being aluminum tends to loosen up on the pin. Clearance is based off diameter of the pin.
Right. Back to that same bearing area. You got to have enough bearing area. You got to have oil getting there.
And if you put your race motor together and you just put the pistons on with a press fit pin, and then all of a sudden decide that you ain't got enough piston to valve, or you change the cylinder head that's got a higher valve seat in it or something, you tear the piston up pressing it back off to cut valve release in it, which you don't want to do
Right,
that after
right,
it's machined anyway, but say you unforeseen and had to. Or
Yeah, stuff happens.
you put a head with a moved valve train in it that don't fit the pocket, you got to move the pocket. So, the floating pin is just a better option for me.
I agree. So we have a couple more questions. Pin button versus oil support ring when the pin intersects the oil ring channel. I mean, the pin button stuff, I've only really seen that on like real big cubic inch power adder.
My blower motor has them in it.
Okay.
The pin button is much better for the support rail than the rail itself. Now, you're the ring guy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing is that obviously when you have, side relief piston and you've got, in this case, a perfect example, the oil ring is intersected by the pin. Yeah, you can put that rail in there and hold it, but the more cylinder pressure, the more boost that wants to flex, because none of this is static.
So if you've got a pin that goes in there
and
that covers the whole thing, that the rail holds the button in, I think that's a better option.
Oh, it's structurally way better. More support, so that now the ring can't move as much, and I would think it would probably even impart some strength to the piston, because again, you're saying, this is the structural part.
Right.
This is the backbone.
And if you're using the pin buttons, you traditionally don't put locks in it, so you don't have to cut the groove in.
Another nice thing to do, because we all hate putting in circlips.
But
no one likes that, by the way. There's no one on the planet that says they like that. If they do, they're masochistic or they're lying, one of the two, right?
I don't know. His father made us a unique fixture for putting in the wire locks, and it works really well. Now, getting them out's a different story.
It's like a snipe hunt around the shop.
Yeah, but as far as that,
circlips versus wire locks. That way, spiral locks. Yeah, same kind of thing.
spiral locks are fine. The true arcs are kind of outdated. They work, but the wire locks are traditionally, I think, the best thing going right now, because the clearance is a little tighter on the end of the pin as far as end load. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can make the spiral lock 0 if you want to, but generally on the wire locks, in my experience, they've been between 12 and 15, but they have a taper on the pin to where if the piston should touch the head or something, that'll knock a spiral lock and a true arc out.
Right.
On a wire lock, it'll eventually knock it out, but it'll take the side off the piston before it does.
You just want to make sure you seat the wire lock when you put them in.
Right.
They're a little more sensitive than a regular spiral.
So that brings me to another question, and I got a couple more here we want to try to get to. We only have a couple more minutes left in this segment, but talking about the pin coming out, or the lock coming out, yeah, I've heard stories, and never experienced myself, but in some big cubic inch engines, really big pistons with pretty big pins, that there can be enough deflection in the pin boss that the wire lock can actually come out itself. Especially, maybe it's more at really high RPMs too, because all that big part means it's a pretty big clip with a lot of mass, and at really high RPM, it can actually unseat itself.
I personally hadn't seen a wire lock come out unless it took the outside edge of the piston off.
Okay.
Or the groove was cut in. Because when that pin with the taper, when it drives against that lock, it's driving it into the piston.
Got it. So one of the questions I want to answer here, John Kazi, thanks for the question. These are the pistons that Diamond sent, so I don't really know all the details of this piston design or what it is, so that would be a question I would defer to the guys at Diamond and let them answer why that shape is the shape that it is, because it's literally just the piston that we have for the thing, because I'm just the dummy talking head at this point, so we're just calling it what it is.
And I'm definitely not a piston guy.
Yeah, John, you know more than I do, and him, so there you go. Okay, here we go. DLC versus bare wrist pins. As a lubrication guy, I'm all about a DLC coated pin.
All right, here you go. Back in the day, 70s again.
Yep.
You could take a stock rod, hone it, take one of your Thompson TRW pistons that had a gas hardened pin.
Yep.
Really hard. You could run it on that rod, steel on steel, and it was fine. You put that pin, a racing pin, the softer pins, but stronger in it, it will gall because they're two similar metals.
Right.
All right. The DLC is so hard, you can put it in anything, it ain't gonna gall.
Yep.
But if it flakes off in your motor, it will destroy everything.
Oh yeah, that's the double-edged sword of DLC. Is that DLC is wonderful as long as it stays on the part. If it delaminates,
it has to be prepped properly and put on properly.
Yes,
Because
sir.
if it comes off in the motor, you might as well pour glass beads in it.
Oh, it's probably worse than glass
Yes.
beads through your motor. So, but it's one of those things where it's a application dictates what the parts you need. And that's been the message all day, that application dictates both the chemistry, or in this case, the coatings, and then we can go there. So now we finished this. Thank you guys for your time. We really appreciate it. Let's go
Thank
to the
you.
next tech chip.
What a day, what a day, what a day. My brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.